Hey guys, what's going on? I'm sure that by now you've heard that Netflix, the service that brought you cuties, has recently made a documentary on the life of Cleopatra and has cast a black actress to play the lead. I sincerely doubt that this is the first time that that's happened, that a black woman has played Cleopatra, but for some reason this has become a talking point this time around. Of course, Netflix has come to be known for casting black actors to play the historical figures who were white. So really, it shouldn't be too notable of a story. However, there were a couple of things in the trailer that I found to be a little troublesome. They give her a bit of a girl boss setup, which is annoying, but it's nothing to take much issue with. What is weird is that they broach the question of her ethnicity. And I'm being generous to call it a question. It's not really anything that's open to interpretation, but Netflix, who has a very large audience of people who probably haven't wasted as much time as I have with Greek history, feels the need to present it as though it's something that historians debate. They do a bit of rapid-fire editing of various people discussing the topic, and we'll go through those and the claims they make. Number one, Cleopatra was a Ptolemaic ruler, and of course, yeah, that's correct. Number two, it's possible that she was an Egyptian. No, it isn't. I mean, she was Egyptian in the same way that Pope Francis is Roman, but she was very much, ethnically speaking, Greek, with just a bit of Persian ancestry. 3, she had curly hair and brown skin. To be clear, the person saying this says that he imagines her to have curly hair and a similar color of skin to his own. And that's hard to say. I'm not sure from the shot. He's only briefly shown on screen, and the color was kind of washed out. But he looks to be maybe somewhere in the vague kinship of Levantine or Indian or Arabic. And while personally I would say that Cleopatra is, maybe a shade lighter than he is, her race certainly resembles his more than that of Jada Pinkett Smith, the actress they've cast. And number 4, the one they've chosen to end on, is probably the worst. And for clarity, it's a black American lady speaking, and she says, "I remember my grandmother saying to me, 'I don't care what they tell you in school, Cleopatra was black.'" And unfortunately, this is probably echoes the sentiment of more people than I'd like to imagine. Now, like I said, Netflix casting a black actor to play a white historical person is nothing new, and honestly not something I tend to care about. The current vogue in entertainment is inclusivity or racial diversity to a sometimes delusional or dishonest extent, and they're just taking part in that for profit. Not much there. Furthermore, there's somewhat of an older precedent for casting people who don't look exactly like the people they're playing. And this takes many forms that don't really need full enumeration here. So what I will say is, just to use the words of an ancient Greek himself, Xenophanes, that is Xenophanes ho Koloponios, the Thracians think that the gods are fair-haired and blue-eyed, the Ethiopians that they're snub-nosed and black. And if cattle and horses had hands and could paint, then cattle would depict gods as cattle and horses as horses. So that's the foundation of what matters. And I don't really think anyone could disagree with it. But there's more to it than that, as it isn't that simple, and there is a reason that, that this has become a point of discussion. And those who would pretend that there isn't any more to it are politically motivated to do so. I think the reason people tend to get annoyed with this sort of transracial casting is that it isn't by accident. Netflix is very much aware of what they're doing. And while in some measure it is just simply playing to the vogue of diversity, and by diversity what's often meant is just the adding of sub-Saharans to things, there's also strong elements of the American perspective and some various political, historical narratives at play. For one, due to the particular history as it regards to racial composition in the U.S., we tend to think of things in terms of black and white, both figuratively and literally. When we talk about people, we assign them to be black or white because historically, our laws and culture work that way. People whose shades of skin fell somewhere between those two were always sort of an afterthought or amendment. And this has left the American cultural consciousness with some difficulty in categorizing what constitutes the majority of the world, who are neither black sub-Saharan nor white Northern European. And so in the past, it's been a device of binary representation. You're probably familiar with some representation of Aesop, the fabulist, the fable guy, as black. Now, Aesop was probably Greek, or at least in terms of ethnicity, not too far removed from that. There is some etymological component of the confusion that reaches back to antiquity, basically constituting that Aesop sounds like Aethiops. But other than that, he resonates as black in the culture of America, insofar as being a slave and a fabulist, which fits into the American trope of the kind of wise storytelling, think of Uncle Remus type trope. You may also have seen a depiction of Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, as a black person. And this is an interesting one. One element of why is simply the idea of having the other. For Romans, Hannibal was very much a big threat and the big deal. Such a national threat that he was an actual boogeyman to children. We have record of a phrase that we use to whip up fear or scare children. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The general and Carthage in general were in many ways the other to the Roman Empire. The empire was not, of course, racially homogeneous, but its citizens nevertheless considered themselves all to be Romans. Civis Romanos sum. I don't think it's a stretch to say that in the American imagination, we are the inheritors of Romanness. If you need any corroboration for that, look at the buildings in our capital. And so with Americans fancying themselves as Romans and the sort of Americans making these decisions comprising a constituency of white people, it would follow that you could think of Rome's other as the other of whiteness, particularly since Hannibal came from Africa. This is a big element in something that may mislead people. You've probably seen one of those images that represents a surface area accurate geography of the globe. And if you have, you know that Africa is a very big landmass, bigger in fact than it tends to look on some maps. And if you've looked at any kind of globe, you would know that places like Greece and Rome, that is to say the sort of places that laid the foundation for the modern West and developed many of the ways that we see the rest of the world, are not very far from Africa. And Greeks and Romans talked and wrote a lot about Africa. And I think that in the modern world, or at least and particularly in America, we sometimes misinterpret what Africa means. And I don't think that's out of any kind of malice or misinformative intent, but just out of a difference in meaning and relativity. We do, of course, call about 1/6 of our population African Americans. Maybe it's not so crazy to think that Hannibal may have been black. After all, I've read a couple articles about Rome's black emperor, Septimius Severus. And Lucius Septimius Severus was born in Africa, and no, not an Italian whose parents were in Africa, but ethnically from that region. You may also see grandiose quotes in Latin like, ex Africa semper aliquid novi. There's always something new out of Africa. And you may see that quote used in interesting ways, but just for a bit of context, that well-known quote is actually a translation of an older Greek one. Ae Libyae perre tikainon. That says Libya, by the way, and Severus, too, was a Libyan. Remember, Africa is a very big continent, but the word Africa, to an American, has a much narrower connotation than the extent of the landmass. And if you asked most Americans what color a Libyan skin is, they'd probably give you the same answer for that of a Nubian. But an ethnically Libyan person is going to have, globally speaking, a fairly middle-of-the-road skin color. The Egyptians, for example, depicted Libyans with the fairest pigments. Some depictions use the red for men, yellow for women convention that the Egyptians used for themselves, but in illustrations that focus on race and the different appearances of ethnicities, Libyans were depicted as white, with Nubians being very black and Egyptians being a middling red. Now we would, of course, if looking at a group of a Libyan, an Egyptian, and a Nubian, call them all African, because we call that massive continent Africa. But if you put the same group in front of an ancient Greek or Roman, then they would just say that the first two were Africans, if not just calling them a Libyan and an Egyptian, and that the darkest one is definitely not African. They probably would have used the term Ethiopian. It's a relatively recent phenomenon that we refer to the entire continent as just Africa. Really, the notion of a strictly named continent that is then broken up into nation-states is relatively recent. You can also compare the word Asia. Herodotus first used the word Asia, and it was in reference to the region of Anatolia and Persia. If you showed, say, a Chinese person to an ancient Greek and asked him where that person was from, the Greek would say something like Sinai or Syria, but would never say Asia. So moving away from this boring rant about etymology, the point is that we have very different ideas of what geographic areas refer to than what the ancient peoples did. And that difference can sometimes lead to a lot of confusion in the modern era. I think probably the most prominent product of that confusion is the American imagining of Egypt and of what ancient Egyptians looked like. I'm not going to rant too much about the we was kings thing. I think most of you guys who would listen to me are probably aware of that. But what I'll say about it is that just the people have been misled. I think it started from being underinformed, and that narrative was created with some mixture of that underinformation along with some political motivation that together made misinformation. And as funny as it is to laugh at people who think that way, a lot of them honestly do. And what's worse is the trend doesn't seem to be on the decline. It was just earlier this year that we had the artist formerly known as Kanye West going on all sorts of TV appearances and making the claim that Jews of the Bible were actually black people. And if you want to dismiss him as a crazy person, then fine. But one, he has a huge audience, and some of whom would disagree. And two, it's not as though he invented any of these things. This is an idea that he was sold on by a not insignificant contingency. These sorts of groups have different names. In particulars, there are Hoteps, Black Hebrew Israelites, Nation of Islam, and more. And again, their numbers aren't waning. Now, to be clear, the problem with those groups is not that they're black power movements or even that they're black ethno-nationalism. I really don't care. If you want to have pride in your race, that's fine. But you're starting on the wrong foot if you're making shit up and denying historical reality. And if you're willing to do that and to rally behind that kind of flag, then there's a good likelihood that you're willing to engage in some other kinds of trouble. And look, I'll admit that it's a bad look for a white person such as myself to cite black crime statistics, so I'm not going to do that. But you can do your own Googling, and if you want some kind of, and you'll find whatever information about how these sort of organizations can be dangerous. And with all this in mind, the misinformation being rampant, the misinformed growing in number, and the danger being present, maybe it's a bad idea to throw this specific kind of fuel onto the fire. Not to generalize too much, but the same sort of people who are probably yas-queening the Netflix documentary are the same sort of people who are constantly talking about the danger of misinformation. And lest I have to repeat myself again, I don't think that casting an actor to play a personage of a different color is necessarily misinformation. But when you ask that sort of non-question right there in the trailer, and you're well aware of the climate into which you're releasing this shit, it kind of really is. To make another thing clear, I don't mean for this to be a unilateral opinion or something that's directed exclusively at black people. For example, given the phenomenon of people to sometimes mix Christianity with white ethno-nationalism, I'd say it's probably better to stay away from the Aryan Jesus paintings as well. And that's something that we are totally comfortable as a culture to mock. It's a hack joke at this point to make the criticism about the depiction of Jesus as a Nordic man. But again, on account of the American binary, when people accept the premise that Jesus wasn't fair-haired and blue-eyed, they jump to the conclusion that he had black skin and dreadlocks. The entire planet is not America. If you want to know what Jesus looked like, talk to a person from the Levant. And it's people that look like that who are the ones I feel bad for. If we're meant to believe in the importance of representation, the concept oft-praised in modern media, the notion that it's important and beneficial that people need to see people who look like them on a screen, then we should occasionally think of them. In Western imagination and history, that region of the world is pretty important, and yet that set of phenotypes seems to be under-rendered. I think we need to move past the narrow-minded and short-sighted American perspective. Yes, in the 1950s maybe we decided to cast some historical figures to be paler and blonder than they were, and I think we really must be close to having our fill of casting people darker and coilier haired. It's time to look at the wider world, especially if you're going to call the film a documentary. And to move away from race to wrap this up, another thing that bothers me about the trailer is the fucking British accent. We as Americans have got to get over our inferiority complex to the British. I think mostly due to our past as a British colony, we have this weird kink about a British accent. And beyond aesthetics, we seem to think that that's how people talked in the past. Most people don't realize how young that sort of received pronunciation dialect is. And I mean like 19th century. Even British people around the time of when America split off didn't sound anything like that artificial posh accent. Around that time specifically, British people would have sounded more like a modern Irishman than a modern RP speaker. But the bigger issue is that Cleopatra isn't Irish, of course. That's just another component of Americanism. We consider the Greco-Roman world to be the predecessor to our own, and so we use the analog of Britain being our parent nation, and use the way we understand them to speak now. And there's also perhaps some influence from British media, with British people just representing historical figures in their own standard dialect. I don't know why we're afraid to do the same thing. And even if it would be too vulgar to deign to make someone talk like the audience, why not give her a fucking regionally appropriate accent? Jada Pinkett Smith is American, and I'm sure she worked with an accent coach to do that god-awful British voice, so I really don't think it would have been too much for her to try to sound Greek. It doesn't have to be a perfect, historically accurate representation of Koine Greek and how a speaker of that may have spoken English, but fuck, just make her sound vaguely Mediterranean. Have her roll some R's or something. Maybe even hit the H sound hard or turn a B into a V. But honestly, I'd settle for some alveolar taps and trills. I would be interested to see what other characters in the documentary speak like. It makes me think of Oliver Stone's Alexander, which, according to Rotten Tomatoes, people fucking hate. 16% critics, 35% audience. I thought it was pretty good, but fuck me. Anyway, a really clever thing they did in that movie, because again, you have this weird, heavily established trope of ancient civilizations speaking posh British, is that they kept in line with that for the people of Greece proper and made Alexander and the Macedonians speak with an Irish accent. People poked fun at that, and I get that it is kind of silly to imagine Alexandros Homegas speaking with an Irish brogue, but it wasn't without good reason. He wanted to emphasize that Alexander was Greek, yes, but not Greek. In a very similar way to how Irish people speak English, yes, but not English. It was a not insignificant social dynamic that represented how some of the more conservative Athenian types viewed Alexander and the Macedonians. So if, say, ethnic Egyptians in this documentary have the heavy alveolar approximants of the American accent, then that would be a nice touch. But that does speak to another reason why it's a silly decision to cast Cleopatra as a black woman, particularly in an American or broadly Anglosphere piece of media. As I've belabored, she and her Greek kin were not black, and the Egyptians weren't black either. But if we consider blackness as a spectrum of skin tones, then the ethnic Egyptians, who were being ruled by an oppressive foreign power, were themselves blacker than she. And in that regard, you could even argue that Netflix is whitewashing racial oppression. And I guess I'll end it on that note. Thanks for listening, guys.